I'm Chase Euntermeyer. I had the special honor and privilege of being director of Voice of America for only about 17 months at the end of the first Bush administration, literally from August 1991 until January 1993. It was a very exciting time because the Soviet Union was in a state of dissolution. And in fact, just the week before I showed up to work, Mikhail Gorbachev was the subject of an attempted coup. And as a great credit to the Russian service of the VOA, he got news of what was happening in Moscow through VOA. And that was, needless to say, a moment of celebration, since we were so used to having hostages in the Middle East saying they got their news from the BBC. But the VOA was a wonderful place to be. I was a political appointee, which meant that when Bill Clinton defeated my boss, George H.W. Bush, that I was out with him on January 20th of 93. In fact, I remember seeing the inaugural platform being built out my window in the Cohen building, the platform being built, of course, in the west front of the Capitol. And to me, it was a kind of a virtual gallows, because I knew that when they finished the west front temporary platform, that not only was George Bush's tenure over, so was mine. But I can celebrate the 17 months that I was there. It was very exciting, not just because of the dissolution of the USSR, but the reappearance of nations that had been squelched for so long by Moscow, so that into my office came the leaders of countries that were struggling to get on their feet, and asked the VOA to be able to help with sometimes not just news and general information, but also very practical information, like how do you start a shop, or how does a banking system work? And all those things were part of remaking the world as of 1991. Something else that happened right at the end of my tenure was revolutionary in VOA terms, and that was the coming of television. Now, television news had been around for only half a century before I showed up, but it did seem to me time that a historic radio organization should begin to make available broadcasts on television in various languages. And significantly, the country that came forward and asked for us to do that was Ukraine. So just days before I left office, there was the inaugural broadcast of TV news in Ukrainian by our Ukrainian language specialist from his studios in VOA. Of course, the internet came along not very long thereafter, and now people have the benefit of sound and sight as well as the news itself. Let me say a word, because we're celebrating here the installation of a plaque in the Cohen building about that particular and very special place. Truth to tell, when I showed up to take over as head of VOA, I had never really noticed the Cohen building. That's a strange thing to say, given how immense it is. But I do believe, thinking back, that every time I'd gone up Independence Avenue, headed toward Capitol Hill, my eye was distracted toward the Capitol, not on the other side of the street, where the immense Depression era, some even called it Stalinist era, building, the Cohen building, was in place. It was a very fascinating spot to be, because it had been built as the original home of the brand new Social Security Administration. And Wilbur Cohen was one of the creators of the Social Security system, and very briefly, Secretary of the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at the end of the Lyndon Johnson administration. So the building was named in his honor. I was particularly interested in the fact that the top floor of the Cohen building was still retained by the Department of Health and Human Services that had taken over from HEW. And that was of historic interest to me, coming from Houston, Texas, because the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare was the great Ovida Kalphabi of Houston, who had been colonel in charge of the Women's Army Corps during World War II and was only the second woman to be in a presidential cabinet. Her deputy secretary was a young man from New York named Nelson Rockefeller. So that was historic grounds, but it was not VOA territory. It was still held on by, I believe, the Inspector General of HHS. The HHS had built for itself the Humphrey Building, which is singularly ugly, in my opinion. And that's why I have welcomed the advent of springtime and summer, because the full leafing out of trees outside my window hid the Hubert Humphrey Building. And I therefore had extra reason to be regretful when the winter of 1992-93 came around, because that meant I had to look at that building. But may they have a long life and happy times in that place. And so let me conclude by just saying a great deal of thanks to the Society of Professional Journalists for recognizing the Voice of America and the Cohen Building in particular as a place worthy to be honored for all the immense service by so many thousands of talented men and women, language specialists, journalists, technicians, all working for a very noble cause for so many years. And that will be remembered no matter where VOA happens to live in the future, and no matter what happens on the world scene. So thank you for this great opportunity, and congratulations to the old shop.